America deserves to hear the truth. Our national debt is too high.
36 trillion dollars. That's the debt. 36 trillion.
120% of GDP and rising debt service costs.
The International Monetary Fund has officially raised the red flag.
36 trillion. It's a ticking time bomb. And according to the IMF, it is ticking louder than ever. The International Monetary Fund, it has issued a direct warning.
Without exaggeration, American debt is a ticking time bomb.
$25 trillion of new debt on top of the $36.2 trillion we have now, which is already the most debt of any country in the world.
It will detonate unless we take serious, responsible action.
Okay, let's dive in. Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive. We're looking at some pretty significant source material today.
We really are.
The topic, it's America's national debt, a huge subject.
Huge is right. And the headline number we're starting with from the source is, well, $36 trillion.
36 trillion. But it's how the source talks about it, isn't it? They don't just give the number.
No, not at all. They immediately call it a ticking time bomb. That's the framing. A threat to the economy.
A ticking time bomb. That's pretty direct language.
Yeah.
Sets a serious tone right away.
It does. And the source brings in, concerns from bodies like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
Right, emphasizing this isn't just a U.S.-only issue. It's got global implications.
Exactly. Which is why our goal here is to really unpack this source. We want to get at the core insights.
Understand the scale, what the source says is causing it, and what the fallout could be for the U.S. and, well, for everyone else too.
So let's start with that scale, because $36 trillion, it's hard to really grasp that number on its own.
It absolutely is. The source puts it at 120% of U.S. GDP.
120%. So the debt is actually bigger than the entire country's economic output for a year.
Yeah. And the source adds some historical context there.
It does. It says that figure, 120%, is higher than the debt levels during World War II.
Wow. Higher than World War II peak spending. That really puts it into perspective.
It suggests a level of financial strain you usually only see in, well, times of massive global upheaval.
And there's another comparison in the source that's just staggering.
Oh, yeah.
This $36 trillion debt, it's bigger than the combined GDP of China, Japan, India, the UK, and Germany.
All of them combined.
Yeah.
That's quite a statistic from the source. It really hammers home just how massive this number is, relatively speaking.
So it's maybe not surprising then, as the source notes, that credit rating agencies are, raising flags.
Right. And they mentioned Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen having to warn about raising the debt limit again.
Which leads the source to describe the whole situation as what was the phrase? A classic late cycle debt crisis.
Late cycle, yeah.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warning how little time is left for lawmakers to raise the debt limit.
Astronomical amount of tax that the government is getting from we the people.
We are at the beginning of a very classic late big cycle debt crisis.
Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
What the source seems to mean by that is the economy's past the point where borrowing felt like maybe manageable investment. Now, the argument is the debt itself is becoming a structural problem, creating instability, like the risky end phase of a financial cycle.
Okay, a precarious position. So the source then digs into why. It lays out these 4 brutal truths, as they call them.
Right. These are presented as the key drivers behind the debt growth, according to this material.
Brutal truth number 1. A spending problem. But the source uses this interesting analogy.
They do. They call it a Gen Z spending problem, which is certainly a choice of words.
Yeah. What's the thinking there, according to the source?
Well, the source draws this parallel, like young adults wanting luxury stuff they can't afford.
Okay.
They argue the government consistently wants like another $1 trillion a year for military, for social programs.
Regardless of the economy.
Pretty much regardless of the economic conditions or, how to actually pay for it. That's the source's take. A disconnect.
A disconnect between ambition and the bottom line, as they see it. Okay,
yeah.
Brutal truth number 2. Taxation inequities.
Yeah, this is about who pays, or rather who doesn't pay as much, according to the source.
The argument being the tax system has become skewed.
Heavily skewed, the source claims, towards benefiting the wealthiest.
And they have specifics on that.
They do. The source states the richest 20% got the lion's share of benefits from recent tax cuts, while the poorest 20% saw minimal changes.
Okay.
And the source directly calls out trickle-down economic theory, mentioning Reagan.
And their verdict on that?
Their verdict is pretty clear. It didn't deliver broad prosperity. Instead, the source argues it widened the income gap. Rich got richer, poor got poorer. Again, that's the source's specific analysis we're relaying here.
Understood. So that's the tax side, according to the source.
When you put a big tax on something, the people will produce less of it. So we cut the people's tax rates, and the people produced more than ever before. The economy bloomed like a plant.
And thus was born a new economic philosophy, Reaganomics. Cutting government spending, cutting regulation, and cutting taxes. Cutting taxes, especially for the richest Americans.
The tax cut bill.
This tax cut really was targeted at the richest of the rich people in the United States.
This whole thing feels a bit like a scam.
We, unfortunately, in the United States are at the very high end in terms of income inequality.
$465 billion. That's how much richer Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the world's richest men got in the last 4 years, according to a new report from the UK-based charity organization Oxfam. That amounts to $14 million per hour. Oxfam says, on the other hand, nearly 5 billion people are poor.
Which brings us to brutal truth number 3, interest payments.
Yes. This one's often overlooked, but the numbers are just stark.
How stark?
The source says the U.S. spends nearly $1 trillion a year just on interest.
$1 trillion, just to service the debt, not even paying it down.
Exactly, just the interest cost. And to give that context, the source points out that amount, that $1 trillion, is more than the entire GDP of 174 countries.
Wow. That's unbelievable.
It highlights what the source calls this relentless cycle, borrowing more just to pay the interest on existing debt.
Which they call a recipe for disaster.
That's the phrase they use, yeah. The source implies it's disastrous because it consumes a huge growing chunk of the budget. Money that could be used elsewhere just goes to servicing old debt, making the problem snowball. It creates this, feedback loop.
An unsustainable feedback loop.
Okay.
That leads us to the 4th brutal truth from the source. The debt ceiling farce.
Yeah, the farce. The source points to a simple fact here.
Which is?
Congress has raised the debt ceiling over 70 times since 1960.
70 times. So the source basically says it's not really a ceiling at all.
Pretty much. Their conclusion is that it's become almost meaningless as a tool to actually control debt. It's more political theater that, in the end, doesn't stop the borrowing.
And the source looks ahead too, right? What are the projections?
They cite projections that debt could hit over 140% of GDP by 2032.
140%.
Which leads the source to conclude the whole situation is becoming increasingly untenable.
Okay, so let's recap where we are. We have this massive debt, bigger than historical peaks, bigger than major economies combined. The source blames chronic spending habits, a tax system they see as unfair, staggering interest costs, and a debt limit that doesn't limit.
That's the picture painted by the source, yeah.
So now, the really critical part. What does the source say about the global consequences?
This is where the warnings get quite dire. The source talks about the U.S. nearing a financial red zone.
A red zone. And the fallout?
And we now have a debt issue, a big debt issue globally that is very important. That's a force, that financial force. And over the next year, we're going to have over $9 trillion of debt that we have to pay back and roll forward, hopefully. Right now, the United States is approaching what I would call a financial red zone. And if we don't act fast, if leadership doesn't recognize the trajectory, we won't just face a downturn, we'll face a full-blown economic heart attack.
Severe implications for global markets.
Yeah.
Potentially catastrophic is how it's described.
Okay, severe and potentially catastrophic. How does this source see that playing out? Like, what's the mechanism?
Well, the fear outlined is that a major crisis triggered by U.S. debt, maybe a deep recession in the U.S., wouldn't just stay there.
It spreads.
It spreads fast. The source warns it could cascade into a global financial crisis. They mention economists talking about a potential economic heart attack.
An economic heart attack.
Yeah. And warnings from people like billionaire Ray Dalio about dire outcomes if things don't change. We're talking about the potential for a stock market bloodbath globally, major downturns everywhere.
So the interconnectedness of everything means a U.S. problem quickly becomes a world problem. That's the core message from the source here.
Absolutely. And they use India as a specific case study to illustrate this.
Right. How does the source say India could be affected? Let's start with the stock market.
Okay, so according to the source, if the U.S. hits a major downturn because of debt issues, big international investors, the foreign institutional investors, or FIIs, they tend to pull money out of emerging markets like India.
Okay, they sell their Indian stocks, and where does that money go?
Often, the source explains, it flows into what's seen as safer assets, like U.S. Treasury bonds. Even if the crisis originated in the U.S., treasuries are often still viewed as a relative safe haven.
Right, so money flows out of India,
leading to potentially significant drops in the Indian stock market. The source actually points to the 2011 crisis, where they say Indian markets fell almost 10% in a few months.
Wow, a concrete example. And what about the Indian currency, the rupee?
That comes under pressure too, according to the source. During global stress, the U.S. dollar tends to get stronger as people seek safety.
So a stronger dollar means a weaker rupee.
Exactly, potentially causing a lot of volatility for the rupee.
And there's another link through India's reserves, isn't there?
There is. The source notes that a big chunk of India's foreign exchange reserves are held in U.S. government bonds.
So if a U.S. debt crisis caused the value of those bonds to fall,
it could weaken the Reserve Bank of India's ability to step in and stabilize the rupee if it starts falling too fast. It impacts their firepower, essentially.
That India example really makes it tangible, doesn't it? How a U.S. debt issue could ripple outwards and directly hit another major economy's markets, currency, even its central bank stability.
It definitely illustrates that web of global finance the source is describing. Which brings us to their concluding thoughts.
Which sound pretty serious.
Very serious. The source says the world is watching the U.S. debt situation with bated breath.
The Federal Reserve will ease the pace of interest rate cuts next year. The U.S. 10-year Treasury bond yield has continued to rise. The U.S. 10-year Treasury bond yield rose 7.6 basis points from the previous trading session.
The public debt has risen past $32.3 trillion this year, and it's nearly 120% of total gross domestic product. With the escalating budget deficit creating a greater supply of bonds, more than demand can meet.
Demand from global central banks, particularly Japan and China, are huge buyers of U.S. debt. They have pulled back, particularly China has pulled back quite a bit. Their holdings are now less than $1 trillion, which is the first time that's happened.
Exactly what happened in 2011. And you will be shocked to know that the Indian markets crashed nearly 10% in a matter of months.
For the first time in history, our country's AAA credit rating would be downgraded, leaving investors around the world to wonder whether the United States is still a good bet.
Stock prices fell this morning in markets around the world in reaction to the U.S. debt crisis. Both European and Asian markets as a whole were down.
$14.3 trillion, an almost unfathomable amount of debt.
This is the biggest economy in the world with the biggest debt that the world has ever seen.
There's a virtual bloodbath on Dalal Street. Sensitive index has plunged by more than 900 points.
The Sensex has breached its 8,000 mark, nearly 6% off on the Sensex, clearly reflecting what's happening around the world.